Good morning. It is September 18th in the morning on Sunday, and a few of us have gathered today to talk about the mental obsession and our experience in our growth, and whether that growth includes growing in a direction that refines thoughts that are wrong, or growing in a direction where we begin to let those thoughts go and grow in a direction that's accurate, is relatively the same thing. When they're looked at accurately, one always leads to the other. And when the accuracy is accurate enough, it begins to become obvious that the natural state of our existence is always true, is always real, is always accurate, is always an awareness that we have. And what we think about it is what tends to complicate it. The single greatest complication in truth is thinking it's not true. And to think thought is not true, what complicates it, to think truth is not true, is only complicated because truth is true, which means there's one way for truth to be. And thinking it's not true now can venture off into every other way to think of it to support the contention that it's not true. So rationalization and justification become natural byproducts of that search for truth that really is based on the denial of truth. And the idea that somehow truth is up to thinking to conclude, rather than recognize thinking is actually a channel for truth and the chance to express truth. That's its ideal function. That's its function, actually. So its dysfunction is thinking about every other way to believe in, trust in, have faith in things that aren't true, which again are complicated, leading to stress and anxiety, and undermine our entire ability to function as human beings. So it leads to dysfunction. And dysfunction puts our health at risk because it's unnatural, and what's unhealthy is diseased. Our bodily systems, metabolic, parasympathetic, the chemical factory that our body produces to help us maintain well-being and homeostasis in our body, are all undermined by stress. And stress mentally, where it's initiated, is an opposition to letting things be as they are. It's just thinking how things are isn't how they are. Now, how that works for us within thinking leads to thinking we shouldn't be where we are when we're always where we are. It leads to thinking that we're not in the present while we're always in the present. Leads to thinking that we need to get something else while where we are is where everything else is happening. So we have everything. And leads to thinking we shouldn't be who we are, when in fact, who we are is exactly who we are right now. To trade stability in, all of those truths are stable. The fact that we are where we are, that we have what we have, that we are who we are all stable. Those aren't in question. They have no doubt. So to think they're not is to set doubt and question in motion. So all questions are effectively doubt, looking for an answer, looking for truth. And if they're all effectively a denial of truth and a denial of reality, something that can't be denied, then they're on a journey that's never going to end, and that would pretty much define human history. We're still seeking, we're still journeying, we're still on a path, we're still trying to get somewhere. And the point is, we've always been there. We've always been there. Ty, who is with us today, has been reading a book, and I forget the Maharaji's name, but it's called I Am That. And it was an interview with a Maharaji back in the early 70s, I believe, after the Beatles had gone to India, by a British journalist who was brilliant, who had all the right questions to ask to debunk and dispel the knowing nature of this guru. And the book is very challenging because the guru basically laughs at all the questions and gives answers that confronted the journalist to the point that he started actually having a real awakening. So for all he knew, he found clearly the distinction between this other form of awareness was also clear for him too. And I would say that it gives us all confidence in recognizing that if it's true for one, it's true for all. And what's absolutely true about truth is that it's unifying. Like it isn't divisive. It's indivisible. It isn't distinct. So there's no distinction. It doesn't distinguish itself, nor am I distinguished from it, nor are you. So we all share that in common. If what we share in common is not what we're expressing uncommon ideas that cause conflict, and then fight for those conflicts in the name of truth and reality that isn't true or real. They're just ideas. Limited ideas masquerading in a parade, trying to look as though they're true and real, but in fact, it's just forms and floats with masks and other opinions being promoted. And that's really all that it is. So the simplicity of all this is simple. The thinking about it is not always simple, but anxiety and stress are good indications that we know better, because we wouldn't be anxious or stressed by thinking things that were wrong. First of all, if they were right, it wouldn't cause anxiety and stress. And secondly, anxiety and stress being seen as wrong aren't wrong, since they're accurately reflecting the anxiety and the stressful conditions we're creating by opposing and resisting the way things actually are. And since we can't really oppose it, we're not really doing it, except to the thinking we're doing about it, thinking that's all that we're doing, and that's obsessive thinking. Constantly thinking about how we're thinking about things, rather than thinking at least that the thing we're thinking about may have some basis in form, despite what we think, or in spite of what we think, or separate from what we think. And then the unity of that form becomes obvious, because it's not what we think about the thing, but the substance of the thing that actually unifies us. It's not what I'm thinking about it. So I suggest that our struggle is largely based in what we think about things, not in the things we think about. So people, places, and things that we think about when they're stressful, and we think we're under attack from them, we're basically attacking them with ideas that aren't true, that we're thinking are true, and end up condemning those things. So we get the impression that they're condemning us. To disown, to continue the irresponsible thought, we want to disown the consequences as being something we've created. And I would say that's a good example of human history. So this aspect of addiction is not talked about that publicly, just like mental health is not talked about that publicly. It seems to have a stigma that keeps people from looking at this honestly and seeing that it's so simple and so silly to continue the masquerade ball and wonder why we feel haunted by thoughts that aren't true, and see them as something happening to us rather than being done by us. And the shift in that awareness is starting to actually look accurately. Ty was saying earlier that as he's been reading this book, he's seeing, I don't know how you described it, the craziness. It's driving you crazy, you said, right? So you're starting to see, I would say, it's not driving you anywhere, because typically crazy doesn't need to be driven to, since it's being experienced immediately where we are, as all things are, because the immediacy of the moment is the only place we ever are. It's the only place we can be. And it's also, by the way, the only place that this truth and reality can exist. Because truth and reality isn't in space and time. Our being nature shares that non-locational aspect and that non-time bound aspect. And to think that's not our source when it is our source wreaks havoc on the way we act and behave unto nature and others that are included in nature. So our natural tendencies are completely obstructed, not completely, but they seem to be, and undermined and twisted, and end up on routes and paths that are very, very destructive. So those are my thoughts based on some of what we talked about last week, but also what we just began talking about before we went to recording, just warming up and saying hello with each other. So welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Jack.
Thanks. I mean, I don't know if driving me crazy is the exact term. I mean, that's, obviously that's a term that we just kind of throw around.
Right.
But maybe it's just, I find it challenging.
Yes. Probably
is a better word. But I'm also finding something is going on.
Yes. I'll give you a secret. You're not finding it. You're just finally conceding it. You're just noticing it because the preoccupation with those other thoughts is being slowly taken apart. And having perspective gives us clarity, right? An obsessive thought has no perspective. It's only trying to make a single point. So it's like standing in a corner trying to get somewhere. Not only standing in a corner, it's like trying to stand in the corner at the floor level, trying to get somewhere where you're both in a corner and where the floor meets the corner. There's no perspective in that. It looks three-dimensional, but there's nowhere to go. So the defense of a point in thinking is constantly trying to make our point and fight for our truth, when in fact there's no truth to fight for because there's no conflict in truth or reality. There's no conflict in an essence of being. And we call this spiritual, but I would suggest that that nature doesn't think of itself as spiritual because it doesn't think at all. It knows everything. It's not a thinking function. It's a knowing function of allowance that gives us the chance to have the experience we're having, because within that allowance, all possibility is possible. That freedom is what we get. What does that mean? We can do whatever we want. We can think whatever we want. We are free. And we're also free to face the consequences and pretend they're not the consequences we're facing, which is generally how we act. While we can't keep the thing we don't think exists, like the thing we fight in our thoughts, we can't keep it from visibility because we end up seeing the manifestations we create in the world, and the world as we see it become reflections of the thinking we're doing that we can't always have the perspective, that we don't always have the perspective in that blindness. But part of the blindness then is also turning the circumstances into exactly the opposite of what they're saying to justify more of the wrong thinking. Just like an addict does, to think the best thing he can continue to do is use more and more and more drugs until he overdoses. To ignore a problem is to allow a problem to grow, just like a weed. So I would say, Ty, that's very clear insight of a knowing awareness that you're waking your thinking up to. Your knowing awareness has always been awake. Your thinking has been asleep to it because the denial of what we're doing is what we're doing attempts to pretend what we're doing isn't what we're doing. So we go into this hypnotic trance thinking it isn't happening, which is the core of addiction, which leads to compulsions and impulses and reactive behaviors. It's very natural because it's a guidance system telling us something is wrong. So to misread it is to continue to do the thing that's wrong to promote the problem, so the consequences get worse until pain is the touchstone of spiritual growth. Meaning that when we can't take it any longer, we finally concede that maybe there's something we could do that's different than what we've been doing. It doesn't take pain to notice the subtleties of these disruptions. We don't have to get near death to finally be aware. And nothing, anything, anybody can say, like the words I say, are ever going to convince anyone to do anything other than what they want to do. And the only value of this conversation, if it has any value, is to recognize what people already know and remind them, if they already know it, that admitting it might be helpful. And what that is basically contemplation and consideration, wearing thoughts, trying to see if they fit, living with them, not denying them and disbelieving them and having no faith in them. And all that stuff has nothing to do with a truthful reality. Truth and reality in its essence doesn't need belief or faith or hope, because it's never hopeless. It's never faithless. It's never truthless. It's never unbelievable, but to thinking. So thinking doesn't make it unbelievable. It just makes the thinking we're doing unbelievable because there's nothing to believe in something that doesn't exist, something that's just self-created, self-imposed, self-induced, self-promoted, self-defended, self-helped, all those things that define self. If you look up in the dictionary the word self, you'll see pages of different versions of self in relation to other words, as though they take on a different meaning, as though the self is independent. And all it is what we're thinking of ourselves. So how do you see that impacting your other thoughts during the week?
It's just, I mean, I've been ever March 2020, I think I shared this, I started walking. I looked out the window, my high rise that I live in, and I said, I need to start moving. And I haven't stopped. I walk. It was every other day. Now it's every day, 2 miles, 2.5 miles.
Mm-hmm.
What I've noticed is since I've been hanging out here and reading that book, as I'm walking, I'm listening to music, but as soon as I turn it off, my thoughts are completely different.
Yeah.
That's one thing. I found, I meditate every morning, 22 minutes, 6 a.m. with a group on the phone. It's a call-in deal. And, it's getting, for me, it's getting a little more deep and a little more interesting. Now, some days, no. Some days I'm completely, thinking about that motorcyclist that drives by it, at a certain time by my window and wakes me out of it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking I'm going to go out there and, put a cable across the street, so he flips. But
That'll fix it.
yeah.
He'll get a bigger bike. So when you talk about the thoughts you're having when you're walking that change, what would you say the change is in them? Since thoughts are always changing, I think you're talking about quality.
Yeah, it's they're not doom and gloom, for gosh sakes. Or if they do, they just come and go.
Right.
Or laugh at it.
Right.
I can't be specific. It's just things have gotten a little more clearer. I can't
That's specific, though. That is specific enough to speak to the general. And when you're speaking to the general, you're speaking to what includes experience. And I would say all experience and the possibility of all experience for all that experience, for all things and all that are, all that is and all that are. So I think that is very clear. And that's why I was fishing for that answer, because my sense is that the awareness of things true do not lead to conflict. They lead to an expansive, explorative adventure of consideration. And the vastness of possibility that we have is to begin to consider that all things are possible, which is also the admission that things that are impossible are not possible. So things that are impossible don't exist except in the ideas we have that are conflicted. And the difference is one is useful and one is not. One is productive and one is not. One is gainful and one is not. One is abundant and one is not. So dysfunction never leads to function unless we give up the root of the dysfunction. This isn't about refining and getting better at being worse. It's about seeing that our nature is already better in terms of being better than worse, because it's not worse, because it is functional, because it is knowing, because it has a good sense of things to make sense, rather than talk about common sense as being the least common thing we tend to see. Other thing interesting about walking, which I think is also another intuitive step in your experience, is that I don't know how many people I've read about. Bill Wilson was one of them. His meditations were largely walking contemplations. And Nietzsche walked up a mountain every day in a suit with a staff and climbed the hill and came back and then would write after walking. And there was a doctor recently that said walking is the most fundamental action humans take because it distinguishes them as humans. Upright walking. So putting our feet on the earth and actually moving over the earth is a reinforcement of our human ability and our human state. And if our human state is based in an absolute nature, and we think only about what we think, we're basically subverting that nature, which doesn't go away. It just becomes unusable to our human experience. So we become useless and feel worthless and less esteem and all those things that people talk about in terms of the social anxieties they have. It isn't because we're worthless. It's because we think who we are is what we think. And when we're thinking things that are worthless, we think thus who we are is worthless and low self-esteem, because the things we're thinking are inestimable. They have no basis. Those thoughts we're thinking about what's true and real aren't true and real. They're just simply thoughts concluding themselves and coming into conflict with everything else because we're continuing to defend them as our truth, our reality, which they're not, and they never will be. But we can continue to think them as long as we want. The irony of the freedom we're given, which I would describe as love, because it's completely free, there's no conditions to it whatsoever. It gives itself to everything that is and all that are, which is a pretty good metaphor and example for the vastness of it. It doesn't fight things to stop or do things. It gives everybody all possibility to do whatever they want. The irony that same freedom we can misuse to think the only thing we should be doing is the thing we can't be doing. And that the wrong thing we're doing is the right thing to do. And think that that's the source of life and life is impossible as a result of our own thinking, and cast aspersions on the entirety of life as though life is hard and difficult, which you hear people say all the time, when life has never been hard or difficult. It's the source of all things possible. It isn't the source of impossibility. But within thinking, plants and animals don't think about that not being a plant or an animal. They just express exactly what they're designed to express, what the order of their genetics and body is designed to express. We seem to be the only dysfunctional creature that does things that are completely contrary to our instinct to survive under the guise and make believe that it's absolutely true and correct. Patriotism, loyalty, allegiance, all things are used to justify that kind of behavior. And I'm not suggesting those things aren't valuable within social structures. Maybe they are. But I'm also suggesting that they've often led to the destruction of the societies they claim to be representing. And if that's the case, I would say it's a questionable premise. Because the reason people kill themselves is they're trying to stop the thinking when it's not the self that they are. They can't kill the self that they are if there's an absolute nature. They're trying to kill the self they think they are in thought, and they become so lowly in their thought and so alone that they think the only thing they can do is finally just end it, end what their body is capable of doing, when in fact they're not stopping the problem. They're actually fully realizing the self-control they've been using the whole time. It's the last final desperate act of self-control to kill yourself. And if the self-control that we've been controlling the things we've been doing wrong to try to make believe they're right is what leads us to that point, clearly it's something we could stop doing prior to that. And clearly, if we talked about it more openly, it might lead to less people thinking that, because they might see that what they're thinking isn't being thought alone at all. It's being thought by many other people, many other times during the day, including people they don't think are thinking it the same way they're trying to think. They're not thinking it by hiding it and thinking nobody else notices. We all sense people who are in stress. It's written on their face, worn on their sleeve. Think of the terms we use. Carried on their shoulder. We see it. We recognize it. We sense it because we're sentient and we're aware. We're aware of our own experience of those things. And seeing them in others helps us be more cognizant of the senses that we're having that are really like a GPS system, giving us an idea of we can continue to go in that direction, and we can also not continue to go in that direction. I will suggest that every thought we ever have is new, and the idea that we're condemned to repeat an old thought is not true, but it's used to give the impression that there's something in the past that condemns us, when in fact the thought there's a past to condemn us is what's condemning us. It's all in the present. The sum total of the present is the culmination of everything that's ever happened, anywhere anything has ever happened. Right now, everywhere everyone is. We are witness to every condition and plant. That tree behind you is the sum total of every tiny bit of growth that palm tree made. And that thing looks like it's 100 feet tall. Every tiny little bit of progress it made happened in the present. Yeah. And so what we see now is that entire past in the present, because that's where everything is. That's what the present is. It reflects everything that's ever happened now. There's no moment in time that's missing from that tree's reflection of where it is. So too with us in terms of our human experience. There's no break in it. There's no gap. We can forget it and pretend it didn't happen, but forgetting it suggests something was there to forget. Just like denial, ironically, actually confirms you can't deny something that isn't there. So deny something that isn't there is to try to give it credit for having existed or shouldn't be existing. So it's twisted again. It's backwards. Gabe, did you ever read I Am That?
No, still trying to get through the Watts book.
The Wisdom of Insecurity?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that does. Ty, have you read that?
Yeah, I read that one. Wisdom of Insecurity.
Yeah.
I'm just grabbing this book just to hold it up for Gabe.
You got the hardcover.
But this is the only thing that was available when I bought it, and I'm glad I did, because I kind of like the color of it. It goes with the and I can't pronounce this name, for God's sakes.
It looks like Sri Nisargadatta. Sri Nisargadatta Maharaja. So I Am That is the name of it. And it's really a brilliant, it's 40 years in print at this point or more, maybe 50 years. And it's really a brilliant taking apart of the premise of both academia and supposed knowledge.
604 pages.
Yeah, and you can I started anywhere, because every question that's asked has an immediate answer, and it doesn't come, the order of the book is almost irrelevant. And I knew I'd read the whole book when I started rereading things.
Yeah, I mean, no, I started at the beginning because because that's the way I was taught. But this guy, I read a little more about the reporter. I think he was like 24 years old.
Yeah.
He was pretty young. And then what was the other book that you read, Gabe?
The
Wisdom of Insecurity.
Wisdom of Insecurity.
Yeah. So I actually did a little better in that book. When I say better, meaning I understand, sunk in a little more. But yeah.
I think all perspective offers more perspective. It enriches our process. And the root of addiction is enabling. And when we are learning, there's a quote by a Dr. Alan Berger that says that the core hallmark of addiction is the unwillingness to learn from experience. But I would challenge that only to one degree. And that is that part of the hallmark of addiction is learning to get better at helping people get worse, which is what enabling is. And when my ideas are twisted, I think the best thing I can do for someone else is cater to their delinquency and foster their delinquency by helping them get worse, rather than confronting and discussing openly and honestly my perspective. By thinking I'm being kind and tolerant when I'm actually being dishonest doesn't help anyone at all. And it's not unkind to be honest. You can use, people talk about brutal honesty because people are brutalized. And when you mention it, it feels pretty brutal. and to get near the same defensive nature, just like the book tends to do. Books are interesting, just like podcasts. Nobody reads a book without being willing to read it. Nobody listens to something without being willing to listen to it. You can be forced, but you won't comprehend anything if you are. So the natural willingness we have to hear and to read is a tendency to being more open to what we read, because we're reading for the purpose of learning something. Whatever the experience is, it's certainly not trying to shut down unless what we're trying to learn is helping us learn to shut down more. But in either case, there's learning, and it's a choice. And that kernel, I was talking about meeting with Herb every month, Herb K. And one of the big issues the last we spent a couple hours talking every month and looking at sobriety and what carrying the message means and how to be more effective is the question. How are we more effective at carrying the message? And one of the interesting points of that, I read something that you remember Werner Erhard from Est? So he's still out there in the world working with Harvard and Stanford and all kinds of universities, and has developed management programs for how people can better interact with each other and be more productive and all that. And during this talk he gave at the Jungian Institute in Switzerland somewhere, he said, he gave a cosmic joke, what he called a cosmic joke. Like you said earlier, as you started looking at your thinking, you started to see how silly it was. Because before you saw how silly it was, those were ideas taken seriously enough to be thought of as true, right? So he said a cosmic joke isn't funny, it's enlightening. It isn't an attempt to bring humor to something, but he said the common nature between a joke and what we normally think of and talk about is that people suspend, typically, they just concede that whatever the guy's saying is worth hearing because the point is the punchline. So when a guy says a duck walks into a bar, nobody's sitting there saying, well, ducks don't walk into bars. That's ridiculous. Ducks don't walk. It's part of the point of the joke that the duck walks into the bar to ask the bartender if he serves duck. Right? So the cosmic joke, he says, doesn't have a punchline. And the joke, as I remember it vaguely, and I'm probably not going to do it as much justice as the article does, but it can be found on his website, wernererhard.org. He said, the first question is that the past has no impact on our present state. None. There is no past to have any impact on our present state. And the second line of the joke is we are always living into the future we're creating. We're living into that future. And the third line is, that's impossible. That's crazy. That's the response. What do you mean we don't have a past? I know when I go to sleep at night who I am in the morning because I'm the same person I was. What do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean? And he said, the punchline is, you can't get the punchline if you don't ask the question. Very interesting that he spent a lifetime on transformation and also talked about the complexity. He talked about chaos theory and said that chaos theory has certain conditions, and I forget what he called them, but it was chaos. The complexity of chaos theory is that you can put a lot of input into something and get very little result. And you can put a little bit of input into something and get great results. And he said that you see that in people. Some people have an awareness and awakening and change completely. Other people can read and study and learn for years and have very little impact on them. So what's the difference in those two conditions? And I think the point he makes about that is the point that's made in the big book about carrying the message. Is it attractive to people, or is it just another distraction? Are we fueling the ideas that are wrong in a new direction, or are we actually introducing ideas that are right? And recognizing that ultimately it isn't how we carry in the message we carry, but the how we're carrying it to the people we're carrying it to. And I would say one of the greatest blocks is thinking they don't already know what that message is. And if I think you don't know it, I think it's up to me to convey it because I have something you don't have. And I'm defying and denying the whole premise of an absolute state of being by thinking that. So what I'm going to do is make sure you don't hear what I'm saying. I'm going to say it in ways to make sure so I can prove the point that it's something I have and you don't. And I would say that's exactly what the disease is compared to the solution, which is available to everyone in any state they're in, that's in any state whatsoever to choose. If they're in a coma, that's a condition that may be difficult to overcome. But interestingly, people in comas often left long enough come out of it, just wake up one day, their body gets better. Whatever it needed was being fostered by being in that coma, by giving it complete rest, because it had been hurt in a way that just needed to recoup. The body needed to do what the body does to regain health. A lot of people after 20 years have woken up, flat out of a dead coma, thought they were gone, which is one of the reasons people are hesitant to pull the plug. So to any degree that we have a choice, which I would say is to every degree, because choice is a function of thinking, not knowing. Knowing doesn't have a choice because it doesn't have any alternatives. It doesn't have any substitutes. It doesn't have anything lacking in it. It's just an absolute knowing presence. And if that's our awareness, and the thinking we're doing is thinking it isn't, simply because the thinking we're doing is thinking it isn't, that it creates more thinking to justify that it isn't, and we get lost on those trails, all we're doing is obscuring it conveniently to make believe the thought we have is true when it isn't. So all conflict, probably worth noting, would be a denial of truth, which can't be denied because truth doesn't change. So when you described in general terms, Ty, your experience and almost groped for something more specific, we're so used to the specificity of all the little details we've come up with to support the stories we tell and give everybody in great detail all the justification we've come up with, and feel offended when they're not listening, when they can't possibly see what we've created in our own brain. And it doesn't matter how well we tell it, they'll never see it the way we see it. It becomes obvious that all that effort is effortless. It's dysfunctional. It has no end. And in the end of it, it means nothing. It's useless. It's not productive. It's not applicable. All it does is help foster more of the same thinking in other people that think their thinking now is right. And all of a sudden, we got a real problem on our hands. Human history pretty well defines this. I would say Bill Wilson opened a door that includes an awareness of this, because he said that the root of addiction is based in thought, centered in the mind. And I would say for humans, the mind is the brain. And I would say for beings, the mind is not the brain. The mind is the mind. And if we're willing to simply concede that our body is designed to function independent, self-supporting, in the sense that itself supports itself, the brain is designed to function our body. It isn't designed to conclude truth and reality. It's designed to express it. And what is truth and reality if it's free but love? And our version of love, even in human terms, is generally either love or conditional love or unconditional love. We have to even recategorize it as unconditional love, as though love has ever been conditional, which it has not. So the distinction in terms is starting to see the vastness of an absolute state is simply simple. It's just what it is, as it is now for each of us. And what that provides us is complete freedom, complete opportunity, complete possibility to choose anew, which we've always done. We've always had what we wanted. We've always been where we are. We've always been who and what we are, whatever that is. We don't even need to be specific to see that, because the seeing of it includes everyone else too. Not just me, not just you, not just us. Whether people think so or not, truth remains the same. So it pinpoints thinking as the culprit and our utilization of thinking as the problem, or misutilization of thinking. And to start seeing that, like you were saying, even recategorizing the immediate comment of being driven crazy to actually starting to seem less confused over things that have been driving you crazy is an awareness that's a simple shift of awareness, a simple willingness we each have to exercise these thoughts in directions that are accurate and true, immediately reveals to us a knowing nature that is easy to dismiss because it doesn't fight for its place. It simply provides a sense of place that's indescribable to the terms we use to justify the fight. Doesn't have any way to describe it. Words are useless in that form. And what's interesting about mathematics is when mathematics approaches the infinite, the numbers start to fall apart. What they keep searching is how to have the numbers stay together when they get to the infinite, but it may be that the infinite, because it's not a dimensionally bound thing, and math is designed to construct dimensional models, that it's telling us the infinite is not in space or time. What are you finding in insecurity, wisdom of insecurity, Gabe?
Every page I read is like pure, to me, pure genius. And I say exactly. I think, it talks about in the beginning, man's sort of search for God and search for being. I think that, I have a lot of conflict with some very good friends who are devout Christians, and who are also sober. And we often battle against each other in sort of negative ways, and push each other away instead of coming together. But I think it talks about, society, which I feel is a little bit insane, is like all the things we've brought upon ourselves, as human beings, especially in this society, to just keep going 100 miles an hour, and not sort of take a look at what is. Like, I didn't even think about that palm tree until you mentioned it. So I find him, just sort of like you said, you can only read a page or two before you have to put it down to think. But I just find everything he says sort of just dead on, really. So I enjoy it, but it's a difficult read, to be honest. I'm not a great reader myself. But I've looked up on Amazon I Am That. I'll try and get that.
Yeah.
As
That'll
well.
make wisdom of insecurity a little easier. Because,
Yeah, to me.
Alan Watts was British, obviously a PhD in philosophy, I think he had, from Berkeley.
And you said he was a drinker.
Yeah. He was kind of a notorious drinker. But he was at Berkeley, during the heyday of the late 50s, early 60s, and probably longer than that. Was a great speaker because he had a language developed that actually could address some of these things and introduce people. He basically introduced the United States to Eastern ideas that we had never really assimilated in this country. And Jack Kerouac, and there was a lot of people who followed this out of that were writing on that basis. And it also led into the LSD revolution with Timothy Leary and all of these sort of seemingly enlightened states that were chemical intoxications, but simply beginning to actually contemplate things that were a little more expansive than the limited ideas that had previously been around. But Eastern philosophy has been considering these things for thousands of years. It's new. It was new in his estimation in that book to Western culture, to look at how Western culture has basically humanized God and wonder why we're in conflict with God or find God to be this contemptful, hateful source that condemns us unless we behave, which seems very humanistic in terms of our history and growing up with parents that tend to expect us to behave for benefits or suffer punishment. It's very Society does the same thing. If you don't behave, you get thrown into a lion's den. But that awareness, I would say, as you see it, Gabe, is an admission of your own awareness, your own knowing. And having no perspective or thinking we have no perspective is one way of nursing those ideas that just stay in this tight loop in our own thinking that constantly are in play to maintain the idea they're truth and permanent as a result, when in fact it creates permanent suffering, or at least chronic suffering and anxiety. And to not notice the anxiety is in fact a clear indication of our awareness of what's happening, is to think of it as something to escape and get away from, which is exactly what causes what reaction is that causes impulsive and compulsive behaviors.
Well, I just looked up some Alan Watts quotes here, just sort of to get my memory. One thing is, what we have forgotten is that thoughts and words are conventions, and that it is fatal to take conventions too seriously.
Yeah. So our knowing nature isn't in language.
Yeah, but that's what I literally think I am or am about or part of, is the thoughts entirely, not partially.
Good.
The whole way.
Good. Well, and thought thinking of itself, once thought is thought to be reality and truth, we immediately think we are the creators of reality, so who we are is what we think. Now, if who we are is not what we think, and who we are is what we think, and we think who we are is what we think, that's a major conflict. So who we think we are is a collection of characteristics that we develop and think of. It's a script we write. And character defects would be defective characteristics.
But
which
even
is what the book is all about.
Yeah, even he talks about words, like these words you and I and Ty are explaining to each other. It's all conventional, convoluted. I don't know.
In Ken Burns' documentary of the West, which basically included Texas to the west, he talked about all of the different Indian tribes that were discovered out here, and said that many of them had no idea. Many of them had no idea that the other tribes existed that were 40 and 50 miles away, because the ground was so able to take care of them, they never traveled that far. So the languages they used were distinct. And he said in many of the languages, good morning, Nick.
Yeah, good morning.
He said that what's interesting is that many of the languages didn't include the word I and me, only us and we. For the whole tribe, they didn't even include the words. The other thing he found interesting was that women were often the chiefs of those tribes. And when the Spaniards came, because they were so contrary, they just killed them, wiped them out, because it couldn't make sense of it. Sturgis, good morning.
Good morning, Jack.
Nick, good morning. Nick's in New York. Sturgis is somewhere.
If you find out, tell me.
No. Well, you're here now. That's all.
Sure.
It's good to see
You're
you.
always here now.
Exactly. Thank you.
Like it's catching on.
You cannot ever not be here now if you're here now.
Yeah.
Well, if we aren't here now, we don't exist. And to think we didn't exist would be to think we existed and didn't exist. We would have to exist to think we didn't. So it sort of runs afoul of the whole thing to even imagine we shouldn't be where we are and shouldn't have what we have and shouldn't think what we do and shouldn't feel what we feel and shouldn't, when in fact we're doing exactly those things. And I think, I'm going to recap a little bit for Sturgis and Nick coming in. One of the basic points in the introduction is that if truth is true, that's pretty simple. So to think truth is not true is to create every complicated idea to support the contention that it's not. And that would be a pretty complicated way to think and live. Not because we can't do it, but because once we start, it tends to create this reactive nuclear hypnotic trance that what we're doing is the right thing because we're eventually going to find truth in reality. And I would say human history is littered with this attempt, and also littered with wars of countries and peoples who have gotten so righteous about their conclusions that they thought the best thing they could do is conquer all other people and oppress them and kill them to prove that they're right. And I would say that's a leap.
Wait. Didn't everyone do that though?
I don't know. I haven't known everyone, but I would say it's pretty historic that as a collective we've done that. However it's shaken out of the salt and pepper shaker, it's basically coming from the same source of thought.
I don't know. I had a thought earlier today that was just like, what do we actually know if the victors write the history? I mean, you ever think about that?
Well, we just think we know more or less based on that thinking, but that has nothing to do with what we know. Because what we know is immutable, it's inviolable, it's indivisible, it's absolute. And if we overlook that, none of the thinking we're ever going to do about all the thinking anyone else has ever done that they call true and real is ever going to be anywhere close to truth and reality, because it isn't true or real. So, Sturgis, to some of what we were talking about last week, with it, I think, I did a little bit of reading this week, couple of things. But one of them was Herb Kagan and I have a lunch every month, and we talk a couple of hours. And the real theme in the last few 2-hour lunches that we have has been, how do we become more effective at carrying a message? What gets it across? And for listeners, that this may be a repeat of what you've already heard, but I suspect it's worth repeating since it gets to the core issue of what is it that makes the difference between somebody getting the message and somebody seemingly not get the message. And one of the elementary issues, my experience, is that if I think people don't know all that I know, I think it's up to me to tell them something they don't know. And if that's wrong, I'm going to act in ways that they don't hear me very well to prove my point, which is an addictive thought. That's how addictive thoughts work. I'm going to create and manifest situations to prove I'm right, not because I'm right, because I'm wrong, because what's right never needs proof, because it immediately confirms itself as useful and applicable anytime I employ it. So when I employ thoughts that are sick, I immediately produce results that are sick. So one of the things I read through a couple of times this week was a talk that you remember Werner Erhard from Est?
Yeah.
So Werner, through these decades, has been working with universities, Stanford, Harvard, through different universities. The Jungian Institute in Switzerland was where he was asked to speak.
Yeah, that's how I think I know him. But maybe I didn't realize he'd done all that other things.
Yeah. So he did a talk on transformation and talked about the difficulty of, he talked about 3 forms of knowing: things we know, and he said, well, you know what to do with that, you put them to use. And things that we don't know, and that's where we learn. And then there's the things we don't know. And he said, and that's the big question. How do we communicate the things we don't know that we don't know? And that's where transformation and this whole concept starts to open up, because it starts, he said, when you think of humans, you think of be, do, have, right? And doing and having are things humans do, but being isn't something that's done, it's something that is. And he said, so the most interesting thing of human capacity is in being, which I would say is our focus, because it isn't a thing we do, it's a thing we are. It isn't something we choose, it's something that we are. It just is what it is, and we are what it is, whatever it is. But he went on to say that he told a cosmic joke, and I'm not going to get into the whole thing again, but the essence of it was that if you're not asking the question, if you're not engaged in wanting to hear the answer, you're not going to get the point. Nobody's going to talk to you in any way that's going to be conveyable, transferable, assignable, recognized. And my sense that part of that issue is not just the asking the question, because I would say asking a question is always triggered by doubt, which is always triggered by thought. But if I begin to doubt my thinking and start to see that as something in total, not just the thought I'm having, but all the thinking I'm doing, I might start seeing that thinking has been at the root of the problem, because thinking about how things are when I'm thinking that they're not how they are would obviously be a big conflict. And so thinking that being isn't something I am and truth isn't something that's true puts me on a search to find what I think is lost, which is not lost at all. So when I see others as something any less than having this information and knowing it absolutely, not in some relative term, not in thinking terms, but knowing they know, aware they're aware, absolutely. And I would suggest if it's true, that is true for everyone in every state of mind, whatever they are, however fractured they are in their thinking, however problematic their body is in their experience, their physicality, their mental awareness, all those things. Wherever they are, that knowledge would be what makes them be there in the way they are, however they are right now. So for those of us who consider it, and I went on a little bit to talk about reading and listening as two ways. Nobody tends to read if they don't want to be reading. So they tend to be interested in what they're reading enough to start to digest what they're reading. They may not get it all clearly, but they're interested enough to get something from it. And podcasts offer that same thing in a new way, which is to listen. People don't tend to listen if they're not interested. And if they aren't interested, they're not hearing. So when they're listening, they're interested. And that interest alone begs the question, because I don't think it's only in the question. I think it's in the participation of the wonder, the exploration, the willingness to recognize what's actually happening compared to what we think is happening, and start to see that the thinking is what we've been so enmeshed in the thinking through history that the whole idea of knowing seems preposterous to thinking. It seems impossible, seems ridiculous. When in fact, it's the preposterous, ridiculous idea that the idea we have about it could be greater than the thinking that's exactly what the conflict is. So to see that as something we all have without being told is to allow the conversation to take on a direction and a potential that wouldn't otherwise exist, because I would be thinking I had to tell tell someone something they don't know that I know, so I'm one up on them, and now I'm insisting they listen to me and hear what I have to say, or else they're going to be fucked and doomed. So I'm going to create a conversation that actually realizes that to prove the point I'm trying to maintain that's incorrect about my own thought. And that is that they need to be told, they need to be taught, and they have no greater knowledge than what I think. So I end up condemning them with the same exact thinking I think I've been illuminated to by thinking somehow, once again, thinking is the sole source of my reality. And I've learned something, but apparently haven't learned it well enough to recognize that if it's actually true, it applies to everyone, everywhere, and everything that is. Everything. And also nothing in addition. Well beyond the everything is contained in nothing. For everything to be, it needs space. Space we see as nothing, and yet it's probably the most profound thing that we face, that we have, that we witness. And I would say in our thinking world, that's the thinking we don't think we're thinking, is the space.
Jack, I have a question. I was expecting like a quip. So, this cult I was a part of as a teenager, they believed that we humans receive messages from the universe because our brains are like radio transmitters receiving signals. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were on their idea that there were certain people who were more connected to the universe, like Einstein and Mozart. Because I don't know, it's just on my mind, so I wanted to ask.
Well, if you go back to what I just said, there couldn't be more or less connection between any of us if it's an infinite source. It wouldn't be possible to have some of it and not all of it. It's impossible. It doesn't mean, and I don't suspect that we struggle with that knowing nature, and I would say that our thoughts are designed to express that knowing nature, but our functional capacity is expressed by how well we take the road signs that we run into and how accurately we look at what we're doing. So I would say Einstein looked at stuff clearly enough to express it. You got to mute, Nick.
Sorry.
You got to mute. There's a lot of noise. Einstein basically attached to, he looked at, he said he used to go into his study and act like a 9-year-old because that was the point at which he was fascinated by everything and hadn't learned enough to begin to confuse that everything he was fascinated with. So he started thinking of things in simple terms and things occurred to him that hadn't occurred to other people. That's just a willingness to notice what we're actually doing. It doesn't mean he had greater access. It means he accessed what he had in a greater way within his thinking. And my suspicion is, my expectation is, that all we suffer with in human experience is a lack of productivity, a lack of usefulness, a lack of functionality because we're dysfunctioning under the weight of thoughts that only lead to dysfunctional actions. And that has us feel ashamed and guilty for the lack of that expression that we know is ultimately ours. So I think the idea that there's things in the universe that communicate to certain people in certain ways is very convenient for the people trying to control the people that they're feeding those thoughts to. And I think that pretty much defines a cult, but it also fits into the word difficult and culture and all those other words that cult follows that indicate something's wrong with that thinking. Cultures are built on ideas to justify what we do wrong. Very often.
So you think that like some of the geniuses in the Western canon, they approached their work with some kind of childlike curiosity and wonder?
I don't know how they did it. I just suggested that's what Einstein mentioned. But I would suggest that that wonder is our natural present state, and it isn't old, so it isn't infant or mature. All that's infant or mature is our physical expression of that state that isn't bound in space and time. So it can't get old. It's always new. Why is it always new? Because it's always present. It's always what it is. It's not what we make of it. And so what maintains itself in that exact way is that it's always available, always accessible. And to allow simple thoughts that are general enough to be absolute, like truth is true, even a lie is freeing. Because all of a sudden, a lie is right. It takes the power out of a lie. It's when lies always rely on thinking they're hidden. Denial is always a function of a lie because it's trying to be exactly what it isn't. Its only claim as a lie is that it's truth, which is the one thing it can't be. So how much existence does something on that basis have? Nothing. But reality doesn't fade when we don't think it's there. Reality doesn't diminish when we don't think it's there. Reality doesn't come and go when we don't think and feel it's there. Those are all conditions of our experience caused by the thinking we're doing about those things, not the things we're thinking about. So our problems are not about the things we're thinking about, but the thinking we're thinking about them with, how we're thinking about them. That's the problem. So if anything holds here, and the exercise here is to start just repeating to your experience, using your thoughts in ways that are reaffirming what's actual rather than what's reactional or not actual, is to reaffirm that truth is true. And right now, presence is present. And right now, we are here. And right now, everything that's connected to where we are is everything that there is. Everything is connected right now. And to think in those terms begins to literally blow the mind, in the sense that the smoke and mirrors that we pose as magical formulas for solutions all of a sudden get blown away, literally, by the movement of air and the space created. A drop of arsenic in the ocean has no effect. A drop of arsenic in a cup of water can kill you over time. The dilution of the problems, when you begin thinking in infinite terms and start to realize that this thing without space and time, the no-dimensional aspects of our existence, it isn't even huge. It simply doesn't allow for anything that's limited to exist. So the only things we actually ever see are things that are forms, which we recognize. We have life forms. We're not living life. We're a form of life. We're a byproduct of life. Life still is life, regardless of whether our forms transform or deform. So thinking accurately and talking accurately, which is what I suspect we come together to do here, but not at all times in all cases, is to aim at that and start to actually just reboot our system and all of our systems and realize they've always been acting accurately. And all of our anxiety and depression is, in fact, an accurate assessment of thinking things that cause stress and creating impulses that collectively cause depression. It's natural. And what scares us is to act against our instinct to survive and act as though it's helping us survive. That scares us because we know better, and fear is designed to help alert us to problems. Fear is not designed to hurt us and cause us pain. It's designed to alert us to a problem so that we can actually get away from that problem. And the idea that we try to run from the bear of our own thinking takes the bear with us in our own thoughts. Doesn't work in the same way that it does in a physical relationship. So physicality gives us a chance to actually see forms, projections of consciousness effectively, and use them as perspective to start to see what we're thinking that we don't think we're thinking, because we can't see our thinking. We only see the impacts it has on how we act out. And acting out is typically thought of as something that's out of order. And seeing things as out of order is starting to see that the idea that thinking is primary to our existence is to put primary before reality, to put thinking in charge of reality and truth, rather than recognizing that thinking is a channel designed to express reality and truth. And if we know all things, we're not getting signals like a radio beacon of a certain show promoting old rock or new rock. We get it all. We got it all. Everyone gets it. And part of that is noticing that in the conversation, there's little bits of awareness that seem to actually be very expansive, simply on our own experience, which tend to be very immediate and often fought immediately by reactive thoughts we're still maintaining. So the clarity of seeing the thinking is actually the awareness that's growing in us, and we're becoming more aware of in relation to the thinking nature, in relation to the human nature that we have, that is natural, that our body language speaks to. And if we read that language properly, we become functionally literate to what's happening. We start noticing the body's giving us perfect signals in terms of its own responses, its own alarm bells, its own whistles. It's alerting us to problems. And instead of running from them, it might be worth simply acknowledging that when we feel bad, we're thinking something that's bad. And when we're feeling wrong, we're thinking that something that's wrong. And when we feel ashamed, we're ashamed for doing and pretending what we're doing is right when we know better. So what is guilt? Guilt isn't a feeling, it is a verdict. And if we feel guilty, we're feeling the guilt of the verdict that we already have imposed on ourselves for doing what we're doing. So how does that translate? If we're doing what we're doing, just begin to notice we're doing what we're doing. And if we're feeling what we're feeling, notice we're feeling what we're feeling. To think we shouldn't be feeling what we're feeling, and shouldn't be thinking what we're thinking, and shouldn't be where we are is a major conflict, because we're always where we are, feeling what we're feeling, thinking what we're thinking. Simple. So the complication, as we began this whole conversation about an hour plus ago, is that if I think truth isn't true, that's where complication begins. Because all I'm going to think about are ways to redefine, rewrap thoughts and words into stories that justify the contention truth isn't true. So truth as truth is simple, 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 because it can't be anything else. And it never is anything else. But truth is untrue, in my thinking, leads to all complications. So the complications are not in life. The complications are not with people. The complications are not on the planet. Life is not hard. Life is not difficult. It is hard thoughts that are difficult to maintain that cause that impression. And it's something I do, and probably something we do, because if we're based on the same platform, what we do wrong is probably not very different, though we give it different names, places, and faces to attach to. So talking about the wrong is actually talking about what's right, because we can accurately assess if wrong is wrong, it's right. It doesn't make what's wrong right, it makes what's wrong as wrong right, because we're seeing it as it is, we're allowing it to be, and now we have a chance to learn what we're thinking that's wrong to begin to expose what we know that's right. So it's a process almost of undoing rather than redoing. So any redoing is resolution, which is a resolution that constantly needs to be reapplied over and over and over again, because we're simply solving it with a solution that isn't really a solution. A solution solves a problem. The problem is no longer a problem. Math is an exercise to masters of math. They're not problems, they're just exercises. Our problems are chances to exercise our capacity to recognize our involvement in creating them and our willingness to continue if they're maintained. It's what we're doing, what we're thinking. And thought is a primary action. To think it isn't is to think it's happening to us rather than being created by us. And while thinking may be thinking, it isn't something we seem to control because it just happens. What we think about is what we struggle with. How we think about things is what we struggle with. It's not thinking we struggle with, it's how we misutilize it that we struggle with. So that's a recap. So Sturgis, let me get to my notes really quick. I think I made a note. Yeah, one of the notes I made from last week, Sturgis, for you was that the idea that the thinking we think is when we think thinking wrong thoughts are true, we begin to think it's reliable, and literally carve a groove out of repetition to give us the impression that we're going to rely on it. It's never reliable, and yet someday it'll become reliable, right? So truth is always useful, always, and applicable. Principles in math are always applicable. But if I think they're not, I'm going to do things in math that make math appear to be complicated when it's not. It's like accounting. Accounting always adds up, which is what accountability is about. It's about balance. If there's any number that's wrong, that's thought to be right, it appears to be hidden, when in fact what's not hidden is that every other calculation seems to come out imbalanced. So that general insight can be good enough to say, oh, there must be a problem here that I thought was hidden. And simply admitting there's a problem in the general at least begins to acknowledge what must be happening to create the lack of accountability that's occurring. And I would say a lack of responsibility is a lack of accountability, and responsibility is the ability to respond rather than react in these automatic defensive ways. So I don't remember what it was you said that drove me to that thought, but I put it after your name and thought it would be worth noting, because obsessive thinking becomes the most reliable thing we rely on, because the only reason we rely on it is thinking someday it will be true. It's the same thing as an addiction. So it becomes so compelling that all we do is keep looking for new reasons to justify it. rather than notice it's not justified at all, it's preposterous, and simply concede it and start to see it fall apart naturally because we're not nursing it and maintaining it anymore. And academia is a great resource. Being intelligent is one of the best ways to use thought in the wrong way, because we can construct these models that seem so logical, while if they're missing any logic at all, they're not logical at all. As you know in logic, that if it doesn't add up, it doesn't add up, period. If there's any fallacy in it, it falls apart. That's the whole point of studying logic. So often the tombs we feel are so difficult to get out of are the ones we're maintaining, but the idea they're difficult to get out of because the ideas we're supporting the difficulty with are difficult to maintain. So it's an echo chamber, a redundancy. It's like a cannibal eating themselves and wondering why they're nervous. And we do it in thought. So the ultimate concession into all that, because I know this can trigger more thought about thought. How am I going to get out of this thought if I've been doing it so long? And all that's happening is the present thought is considering things in a new impossible way to contribute to the impossibility of the thinking ever ending. When in fact, the choice is always free, and seeing it clearly is starting to say, I know more than I think. 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 If I know more than I think. My thinking isn't the source of that knowledge. It's just the knowledge is the source of that knowledge. Knowing is the source of knowing. Awareness is the source of awareness. And it starts to put the academia, the intelligence we've developed, to good use, because we can actually employ those same things we've gone to such great lengths to try to deny what's happening in applicable directions that become obvious, because we start noticing how useful they become immediately. And the confirmation, I think this was part of the other point too, because you asked about, now I'm remembering last week a little better, you asked about what are the practices? What are the exercises? Am I right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I was,
Yeah.
yes, that's right. I was trying to pin you to just talk about what we're doing when we're talking here, which my point I think was, and I think your point is also, is that we are practicing this.
Well, the other thing too is to recognize that even the best people continue to practice. The best violinists, the best tennis players, the people who actually are better tend to do it more, right?
Yeah.
So the best basketball players practice all the time. People who want to be basketball players think about it on the couch.
I guess there's an interesting one there. I mean, not to disagree with that, but I sometimes, in thinking along that same line of thought, I then think about like Fitzgerald and I'm not going to remember this well, but there was this sentiment, at least from Hemingway, that there was a moment in time when Fitzgerald was writing perfectly, with nothing in the way. And then eventually he put something in the way, sort of after like The Great Gatsby, which from Hemingway's perspective was like a perfect piece of writing. And then he kind of got in his own way, and it just wasn't as good. Yeah. I'll pull up the quote. I mean, Hemingway's probably up to something in his own right during that quote. but I think about that because, to your point, there's, in the creation element of something like writing fiction, I guess, there's a lot of that act that orbits around, what your point is around this conversation. I mean, it's certainly present in acting. I know I've heard some of our colleagues talk about it, in that the acting is listening, right? And reacting appropriately and honestly.
Which would be responding, because
yeah. Well, to your point earlier, it means listening,
considered,
and I remember reading a Pacino quote saying, why do you act, right? In one of those, James Lipton interviews or something. And he kind of joked and he said, well, it's better than thinking. Thought that was pretty well put.
Well, one of Werner's things in there was that he developed, I forget the woman's name, who's a major acting coach. He developed a program, a 3-year program, because he said, what is it about actors that allows them to suspend who they think they are for a role that they take on? And so what he had everyone do for 3 days is he said, pretend to be somebody else in the world, just anybody. So what Werner pretended to be was Werner. So he took on all the characteristics he wanted to take on. And he said, it was the most freeing Werner I've ever experienced because I did everything perfectly. I did it according to a script.
Right.
And I would suggest that the difference was, and what they came out with, he said that the best acting is when you're not acting, when you start being that character and you take it on with the ownership of it, that the other character you've been playing disappears. And Jim Carrey went through an episode after having done Man in the Moon and took on Andy Kaufman's role so much, when he said the movie was done, he forgot who he was and realized who he was so flimsy to even be forgotten, and realized it was all in thought. And he's had a huge transformation, spoken at an Ayurvedic convention that I've mentioned before. That's a very interesting, wise presentation that he gave to that group. But here's the essence of the point that I think I was getting to with you. And sometimes it's ethereal enough, I can't write it in words enough to capture the essence of it. But let me see if I can put it into words for a second. If what we're practicing is addressing a process, we're still practicing thinking. We're still trying to get thinking better. We're still trying to refine what we're doing. You were talking about writing as a craft. Those are all refinements of actions we take that are expressions of thought. But if all we think we get better at doing is thinking better by thinking about the thinking we're doing, we're never quite conceding that the knowing that we have is in fact the natural state of our being. And the ultimate expression of that knowing comes naturally when I'm not thinking about what I know and simply expressing it.
Yes, I that resounds.
So that's the potential we have in every moment to begin to see that I can launch in any direction I want, right? But any direction I launch to try to get where I'm not is going to conflict with that basic idea and premise. Any idea I have of going somewhere else. And I would suggest with Fitzgerald, which happens with many people, when they struggle and strive. Henry Miller, the first 2 books he wrote were the most popular he ever wrote, because he was in the face of nothing trying to achieve everything. He was in the face of no success trying to be successful. He was in face and having nothing, and he talked about it on the first page. He said, I'm a failure. I'm a complete loser. I'm the happiest man alive.
Question.
Because he gave up everything. You know, Tolstoy in the beginning of Anna Karenina says every family is happy. Every family is happy in the same way. Every unhappy family is unhappy in their own way. What does that mean? We all each individually create our own misery in the thinking we do. And yet the happiness is all based on the exact same thing, which is the freedom from that thinking.
It's worth quoting Hemingway accurately, because he's making your point. What he says about Fitzgerald was that his talent was as natural as the pattern that was made by the dust on a butterfly's wings.
Yes.
And at one time he understood it no more than the butterfly did, and he did not know when it was brushed or marred.
Yes.
Later, he became conscious of his damaged wings and of their construction, and he learned to think, and he could not fly anymore because the love of flight was gone, and he could only remember when it had been effortless. I think that's a pretty elegant way of saying exactly what you're saying.
Well, and yes, and what's beautiful about that is seeing that the real conflict is making all the ideas I have about myself, when they're confirmed by the admiration other people give me, reaffirms that those thoughts I had about who I was are right. So what do? Become self-conscious about those thoughts again. And ironically, self-consciousness, if you think of the term, would say to imbue self with consciousness, but in fact, the term means undue regard for appearance. right? So what
Right.
is that?
Yes.
It's the imposter I impose on the ideas I have, that I finally develop something in a craft, and I don't say, this is the natural expression of that knowing self, because I've been relying on something to try to achieve admiration from others to confirm the something I was relying on was true by giving them truth and reality and that admiration. I will suggest also, a friend of mine, I grew up with a guy in a family who trained professional fighters. And what's interesting, if you look at fighters' lives and arcs, including Mike Tyson's, one of the greatest fighters pound for pound that anybody's ever seen at the time, when you get to the top, you don't know what to do with it, because all you've ever done is train to try to get there. Your whole life's been spent trying to train to get there. And when you're there, people lose focus. They start to get dizzy. They start to spin out, literally. And time again, you see that in athletes. They become so good. And in fighting, it's a very different sport than basketball, because it is not a team sport except for the team that gets you into the ring and stands in your corner. You're out there alone. It's one person showing the resolve they have to win that match, while they're taking all the brutality that comes their way and dismissing it as irrelevant to their point. But the guys get there, they lose sight. They fall off the mountain.
Well, yes, I agree with that. But I think the thing that leaps at me when I read this, and listen to you too, is that we haven't touched on as much, I think, is the love of flight, or in your example, the love of fight. Jordan would say the love of the game.
Yeah.
Well,
the game has potential to win or lose, and losing is part of its potential. Insanity thinks right is only right, and there is no wrong in it. There is no loss in it. It's only gain. That's the insanity of it. It isn't a game. It's a death wish. So a game.
Yeah, and I guess when you're just loving the game, you're not. I mean, I think my point is, there's a moment when you're not concerned about winning or losing. You're so in the zone, as many have studied, right? That you're just there, and it's powered, and it's powered by, I think an exhilaration of finding that, that love of the moment. Or remembering it. I mean, there's a, I don't know if you've ever sailed, but I can remember really powerful moments with my dad. There's a term for it when he would take me out on a boat, when, you just find the wind and the whole boat just kind of relaxes.
Yeah.
And
Trim.
Sorry, someone had it.
Oh, the zone.
It certainly is, but there's a term for it in sailing too. I can't remember. I'll have to ask my dad. But I can remember it as a little kid. It's from and being so struck by it, because you're sort of fighting the pressure of the wind against the sail, and then it just finds it. Maybe it is called the zone in sailing. I can't remember. And then it just relaxes, and you can kind of lean back, and there's no tension anywhere, and you're really at one. It's a incredibly powerful experience.
So but thinking of that, you're seeing that the alignment of action with nature is ultimately the expression of what's possible in its highest form. Because that boat's probably under less stress, probably not breaking down, probably cutting through the water smoothly like a knife. It's starting to exhibit all the traits that are possible to achieve by thinking accurately about what's happening, rather than inaccurately and thinking somehow you'll overcome the inaccuracy of nature, when it's only what you see about it that's inaccurate. Starting to notice that's our functional human capacity is undermined by our dysfunctional thinking about an absolute source not being our absolute source, or it absolutely only being what we think it is, which is another way of saying not absolute. And starting to concede this is to start to actually have that sense of peace that you just described and see that the nature of our body is not designed to be under stress and turn into disease, but it does those things at indications that something's wrong, just like the buffeting and all of the things that are experienced in the boat before it becomes seamless, like Chuck Yeager, who broke the sound barrier. Every guy prior to him every guy prior to Chuck Yeager approached the sound barrier, and the plane started shaking so viciously they backed off. And he realized that's telling me you're at the actually apex. You're right at the point when it's doing that. You just need to push through. And the sonic bomb, nobody knew there would be, I don't think they knew that the sonic boom would happen. But when he broke through it, the collection of all that pressure released into that sonic boom. And he said the flight became smoother and more graceful than anything he'd ever flown. Same plane, same air.
Well, and the same thing, of course, happens once we've seen it in a million movies, right? The beating of the air against the vessel of the rocket until they finally reach outside the atmosphere, when, of course, it's calm and floats.
Well, and what was interesting for him is he was still in the atmosphere. So the air was still there. It was still resisting the plane, but it reached a terminal velocity, I guess it would be, that was sufficient to overcome the buffeting because it was now operating in alignment with the plane, and the friction were in perfect alignment, which was supersonic, which meant that it was beyond the speed of sound. So interesting that flight becomes perfected at a point at which it exceeds the bounds, the audio bounds or limitations of those audio bounds.
Not everyone would come up with terminal velocity, though, Jack.
Well, I appreciate you repeating that.
It was good. It caught me. I was like, oh yeah, I mean,
it's like falling.
You always articulate for us, and I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed our talks our text during this week. It was, I think some of what we're talking about today, Jana, is very much what we were talking about during the week. And that is, what is the point at which we turn from the ideas we've been maintaining that seem to be right and true, that always cause the conflict, and begin to notice that ever-present state of being has always been available, and we've always been re-choosing. We've just been choosing from the list of thoughts we could choose from, rather than allow the knowing nature to begin to allow that choosing to happen in a way that's aligned with what we know rather than what we think we don't know. And that turn is really the difference in my experience. And I mentioned that I have lunch with Herb K every month, and we talk about how is a message carried more effectively? Because he's done workshops for years and thousands of people, and sees clearly that some people get it and some people don't. Some people walk away doing in a new way the same thing they did when they walked in, and other people literally just get stopped in their seat and don't even know how to get up when the hour and a half is over. I mean, it just stops them because they're just sitting there looking at things in a way that are so like I think Gabe was mentioning, in terms of the awe and the exploration and the awareness and the openness, that sort of awareness of genius that we can hear other people express is the awareness of genius that we naturally have. And it isn't genius to genius. It's simply intelligent and genius to the lack of thinking we've been doing and the depreciated state we've been expressing in our own human incapacity as being all that we could do. It's just the comparison between the two. If Einstein was a genius, think of the knowing that he exposed as being the knowing that's always been. It wasn't new. He just happened to mention it. And if we're not talking about things openly and honestly, we're not mentioning the greatness that we already share, and as a result, acting like we need to be grandiose about things that have no basis, and trying to be admired for things that are really not that useful if they're not useful for everyone.
But that's the deal. I don't feel that anymore.
Yeah.
I'm growing up.
It's good. When I got sober, I used to say I'm either growing up or I'm throwing up. Because my stomach would just feel so nervous and so much anxiety. And so just like I did as a kid when I was about to go to school and wanted to stay home and just had that nervous anxiety driving me.
I have a new mantra.
Uh-oh.
What if everything is okay?
Yeah. How about get rid of the what if?
Well, I'm not quite there yet, but I have made like leaps
Well,
and strides.
But just as a concession, I'm suggesting, the exercise, and I think that's part of the point I was getting to, Sturgis. If my exercise is trying to get better at what I've been doing that's worse, it's still connected to what's worse. And if I'm trying to do it different, I'm really connected to the same thing, doing it differently. And the real awareness of starting to see an absolute nature is to realize that it's never repetitive. It's never a choice. It's our absolute current state of being and awareness right now, all of us. And to concede that allows me, because what I'm doing is introducing my real self to the self I think I am. And that self isn't something that's me alone, but what we all share. So it doesn't have distinctions. So it's indistinguishable. Doesn't stand out because it doesn't stand up. It just is what it is.
Yeah, I can allow that. I accept that. I think you're reminding me of the
Of what you know.
you're reminding me of what I know, and you're reminding me a little bit more of the conversation we were having last week, which was really my questions were around that repetition and sort of pointing out that this conversation that we have once a week is one of them, and sort of why we do that, right? Like, why does Jordan keep playing? Why can't, I guess there's some more obvious reasons for this, but, why do our famous quarterbacks like keep coming back to the game? Because there's a love of it. There's also billions of dollars, but, I come back to this conversation because of a recognition of what I know, which I'd like to continue. So maybe it's not a repetition I'm talking about. It's just, I like stepping back into this space, or stepping into this space from, wherever I go during the week, because of an instinct, I think, to seek this space, right? I mean, you could find parallel language for that in the book about seeking God, right? Seeking is I think what I was scratching at last week, and maybe repetition is kind of the wrong word, but the continued seeking of it is maybe a more accurate sort of capture of what I'm aiming for.
Well, seeking also, though, suggests that it's somewhere else. And I would say that the word is indicative of the idea that thinking is going to think its way into the solution rather than already knowing that there is no problem. And to the point, Jana, I wasn't trying to suggest you think of things other than what you're thinking of them. But if you're considering what if everything's okay, you could also consider everything's okay. And the preposterous nature of that is ridiculous to think thoughts that don't think everything is okay. And the clarification of seeing the confirmation of those thoughts in the consideration of everything being okay is the beginning of starting to say, maybe everything's always been okay. Maybe it's what I've been thinking that's been the problem the whole time, and starting to actually identify thinking as the culprit rather than thinking about truth and reality as the culprit, because truth and reality have never changed as long as we thought about them. Regardless of how bad we've thought, how well we've thought, how close we got, all those thoughts are irrelevant because it's still true and real. And it's the one distinction to the game we play in the experience of life we have, where we like to win. Winning's great because it generally means the apple you chose off the tree is edible. There's some value to it. There's some usefulness of it.
But our interpretation of winning shifts when we grow up too. It's not just about us anymore. It's about all of us. It's cumulative. And the only win I feel is when I feel like the people around me are winning as well. I don't feel like the one-upping. And I've always had this in me, and I've always had the compassion for other people. But we have to know that since 1980, I've been licensed as a realtor and a real estate broker since 1990. It was not that kind of an atmosphere naturally. It was different. And I had to come out of myself to succeed at it. But I also succeeded because of my inner thought that we were all in this together. But it's still been a bit. And my extraordinary circumstance now, in my concession, I get recognition of my own responsibility again for how I think about everything and how I interpret things. And a little bit of shame comes up, but a lot less than it used to. And I'm giving myself permission to be okay in these extraordinary circumstances. And I think that it's freaking people out. Like, I should be freaking out more. I mean, my human, my person, my partner has completely slipped away and we don't connect anymore. And I think I'm going to be okay. I mean, I know I'm going to be okay, but it's just not, it's horrifying, but I see the reality of it and I'm doing it.
So knowing, a winning always infers losing. And an absolute knowing state of being does not win or lose because it can't do either. It's just an absolute state of being. And part of the goal, I guess, of this, if we're trying to kick it through the uprights, get a field goal in this conversation, it's beginning to concede that state doesn't change when we change. It doesn't change when thinking change. It doesn't make any difference. And to remember that in the midst of all the thinking we do about the trials and tribulations that we're bound to face, because things are bound to go where they go in life, not where we want them, not where we think they should, not where we expect them to. The guarantee is they're going to go exactly where they go, however that is. And to resign ourselves from using thought to only think it should be what we think it should be is to reduce an enormous amount of conflict with how it is and ends up being. And part of that conflict is thinking we shouldn't be where we are, we aren't who we are, things, how we feel shouldn't be what we feel, etc. Rather than just begin to concede that we've actually got a pretty good Geiger counter, our body, telling us accurate information. When you feel that shame, I would suggest that's just an indication there are things you're still thinking that are shameful, that you're ashamed of, because you know they're not true. And
that I could have been stronger, that I could have prevented it somehow.
Yeah.
That I wasn't paying enough attention, that I could have controlled it.
But keep in mind, the reason you think all those things is to generate more impossibility that you're ashamed of. And the immediacy of our experience isn't feeling something that happened. It's what we're doing with it that's happening now that we feel. The presence of the presence is where everything happens. So it's what we're doing now. We started with this last week, and it's probably a good place to end today. But the immediacy of the moment is where everything happens right now, right now, right now. And what we're feeling is based on what we're doing right now. And the salvation of that is seeing that there's no obligation to continue doing the thing that we're ashamed of. And yet we can. We have the freedom to continue to do it exactly as we've always done it. And what's interesting is when you begin to notice that you're not obligated to continue and you continue, it will get less interesting to continue because you'll start realizing your perspective has returned to realizing it's not something you have to do and it's not something happening to you. It's something you're choosing to do. And the choice will become much less interesting very quickly, much quicker than it took to seemingly divine the idea that you can't stop and that it's the only thing you can do. And it's the only thing that you've ever done.
Delmar's here, you guys. Say good morning.
Hey, Delmar.
Good morning, Delmar.
Aloha.
Aloha. So if we all share as a species something in common, and we don't talk about it honestly because we don't think about it honestly, then that would be a collective flaw that has led to all the dishonest actions that have been corrupt through human history.
Beautiful.
And we are living in the moment where the culmination of all those corrupt ideas is becoming more obvious. And yet for 50 years, we've denied global warming until now. And I'm not saying it's true. I'm not saying it's real. I'm not saying it can't be chosen or helped. It's just interesting that for 50 years we've talked about it and done almost nothing but continue to make it worse. If the things we identified as being bad back in the 70s were the same things we've identified now that are causing some of the problems we're witnessing, it's pretty good evidence that we are very good at denial. We're very good at postponing. We're very good at thinking something will get better in the future because what we're doing is wrong in the present. And if we come back, Sturgis, for this, I would say it's the reminder of recognizing that denial is what drives us back here. It's the things we're not doing that are accurate that gives us the impression we need to reconnect with people, because to think we need to reconnect with people is to deny that we're already connected to everyone. And we don't need to be told that to know that. But to talk about it at least introduces to thinking that considers things that still aren't true will someday be true, starts to kind of blow the cover and put a little light on it, and that allows it to become a little less incumbent on us to make believe that somehow it's absolutely true, when you start realizing that we're all struggling with the exact same thing because we are no different. If our essence is no different, then the things we do are the same with different disguises and masquerade balls and parades that we create to try to make it look different.
Well, that's exactly why those stories, that the specific instances have no value really, except maybe to relate on a human level so that someone can recognize that specific thing. But none of the stories matter at all. It really does all go back to the principles, or at least in my experience.
Well, I would say that the essence of being is a weightless experience, kind of like Hemingway described, the dust on the wing of a butterfly. Doesn't even notice it's there. It just flies and it does what it does and doesn't consider it. Doesn't have any impact, so it's not noticeable. But if that nature is our nature, then freedom and absolute peace is our nature. A sense of love is our nature. A sense of presence is our nature. A sense of being and belonging. Belonging wouldn't even be a question, because we wouldn't be long or be short in our ideas about what's happening. They would just align naturally, which they do. So the corrupt nature of the thinking that continues to go on are the lies we continue to maintain and make believe aren't happening, or are happening to us by all the people we assign the blame to, and all the responsibility of society and everyone else, and thinking we can be exclusions from it is exactly what allows the problems we see to continue.
One of the biggest things you gave me permission to not do was to not spend hours torturously meditating. Seriously. And now everything I read mentions that it's bullshit. You don't have to try so hard. We just are. It just is. Our life's a walking meditation.
Well, and yet if we're meditating on sick thoughts, it tends to produce a very difficult meditation. So
nobody said that.
Well, the fact that you can laugh at it is the ability to see it. It's why in drama and comedy, they're both the matching faces, with the upturned and downturned laugh or frown. Seeing it with clarity is to laugh at it. Seeing it as though it's true is to take it seriously. And to think there's something to even be taken seriously is to give something.
I don't think there's anything to be taken seriously.
I would say in an absolute state of being, you're absolutely right.
I think had I taken things seriously previously, it would have been a waste of time and energy and negativity.
Well, it's not waste. If you're doing it, the waste is to think there isn't some purpose in it. And if the purpose in it is sick, it's to help us see that we're doing something we don't think we're doing. And the simple acknowledgement of that, we don't need, how it tends to be that my experience was I used to always look to the past to figure out what was wrong with the present.
Exactly.
But I'm looking from the place where I'm creating the culmination of all my thoughts about the past are in the present, just like everything that's ever happened is expressed in the present. See you, Sturgis. Peace. Everything is always the culmination of everything that's ever happened is the culmination of everything we see in the present. So when I'm thinking the past has some buried story I need to find, I'm not thinking correctly about what I'm doing right now. I'm thinking about it as somewhere else, something else, which is wrong. Difference between wrong and right is that wrong has no applicable purpose and right always does. Principles always are applicable because they're fundamental to existence, fundamental and essential. Essence is essential. It isn't debatable. It isn't negotiable. We can debate it and we can negotiate it, but all we're doing is debating and negotiating in thought something that has no basis outside of thought. And if it has no basis outside of thought, it has no place. And if it has no place, it does not connect and interact with everything else that's happening and is a pollutant, is a contaminant, is a poison to the collective whole.
Yes, that's what people don't understand. That it's not okay to not be okay. To purposefully not be okay. You're dragging everybody else down.
Well, and to think of them as people doing that is to think with the same thought about them that they don't know any better, and it becomes conducive in the overall thinking that we think we see what everyone else is doing so clearly while we're still struggling with issues that we don't see that clearly in ourselves or in our seeming self. So it always tracks back. I would say if we're not seeing it clearly, we're suffering the bodily incapacities and disabilities that naturally occur, like the anxiety disorders and all of the undermining our metabolic systems. And, feeling well is about well-being. And if we're not thinking well, we're not feeling well because we're causing impacts on our body that literally create diseases. I mean,
people hold on to that, though. I've heard people say in the last 5 days, I've always had anxiety. I have so much anxiety. I don't know what kind of a response they want, but I hear it almost every day.
Trust them. Trust them.
What do they want?
Trust them. Trust them. They've had so much anxiety. That's probably a very accurate. I would say that's why we're talking about this, because it isn't being talked about. So
I think they hold it close, though. They hold it close and they use it as a personality club. They're like, I'm anxious. And then you're supposed to hug them and coddle them and help them out of their anxiety or something. And I just go, who the fuck isn't? Whatever. I think it's stupid.
Have you ever done that?
Yeah, it didn't go over very well, by the way. It was with that one person I talked to you about. Now I'm out.
Yeah.
Didn't work.
Listen. Don't underestimate your potential for doing the things you see contemptful in others. And I would say one of my biggest shifts, two things, was beginning to recognize that I was thinking things I didn't think I was thinking, which meant that I was only dealing with the things I thought I was thinking and thought that was the entire domain of my thinking, until I began to realize that there always seemed to be something else acting on me that seemed inexplicable. And why would that be? If I was aware of everything and the thinking I was doing about the thinking I was doing.
What was the unexplicable? Was it a feeling in your body, like a sore throat or stomach ache or something grabbing
you? It was just a seeming haunting sense that something was wrong.
Oh, okay, lurking. Yeah, I got you.
Yeah. Which leads to all of those other things, because my body gets depressed. When I get depressed, I become susceptible to bacteria, viruses, colds, flus, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So our body, when it's not healthy, becomes susceptible to disease. And it isn't because disease is common. It's because the susceptible nature of our body has been made common by the chronic nature of the thinking we do that undermines the ability of it to function. So the second part of that, Janet, was to see that the only things I hid in the thinking I was doing that I was thinking I wasn't doing were the sickest thoughts that I was having. And the primary thought was that someday my thinking will end up solving all my problems. So I left all the deeper, darker things in the dark, thinking they weren't there, like a kid thinks there's only ghosts, and then felt like there were ghosts and haunting images in my life because the lights were off. And
your awareness brought them forth, because I thought you were anti-therapist.
No, I'm not anti-awareness, right. I don't, and I think therapy is great because it gets people talking. I don't think trying to assign responsibility to things that aren't happening is the right approach. But I think ultimately in therapy, it's beginning to bring people into the present so they start talking about what's actually happening. So I think it can be misused, and like everything is possible to be misused. Certainly that's one of those things. But starting to think in terms that I was thinking things I wasn't thinking also put me at peace with the things I thought I was fighting to keep down. And all of a sudden, some of those things started to become part of my mental awareness. And I started to see that actually I had a relationship to them that was peaceful because I was acknowledging that I was doing what I was doing. And it gave me a greater sense of presence. Not that I didn't have a greater sense, but I didn't have that sense within thought, so that my thoughts could start to align around that rather than react to it and protect it, because I'd set them on a mission to pretend it wasn't there.
Okay, that's the sentence right there. Align around it rather than align around it. Yes. Around the thought. That's it. Instead of like challenging it or fighting it or thinking that it's ugly, mean, or bad, just let it be.
Well, you can even say it's ugly, mean, and bad, and that's accurate. Because I would tell you that that's where the terror and the panic and all the turmoil, and I would suggest the present traumatic stress is held in the present moment, thinking it's somewhere else. To think it's somewhere else is to think about a time and place that isn't happening. So the impossibility of ever managing it seems impossible, or fixing it. And the present awareness of it is the beginning of starting to dilute it by bringing light to it and show that it isn't in the dark. There is no darkness. It's only the thoughts I have about it that are wrong, that are obstructing it and ending up giving the impression that it's shadowed and gray and dark. Shadows of think of the term we use, shadows of doubt. we're sort of reflecting that we create this matter that we think matters when it doesn't have any even existence. And then we cause the appearance of shadows to be cast, which are darkness, and wonder why we feel haunted. It's a very clever approach to a deceptive way of living and thinking. And I would say, coming back to this conversation, is an indication that we are all still masters of denial and learning to experience and exercise our awareness of reality and truth and love. We can do little things to confirm it, because as I described earlier about the chaos theory, you can input little things and get huge results. And I would say those are things that apply, because a little bit goes a long. You don't even, the old term, give them an inch, they take a mile.
Yeah, clearly.
When it comes to conceding reality, you can give an inch and get a billion miles because you're dealing in something that's non-spatially bound. So in chaos theory, there's one direction where you can put a lot of input in and get nothing back. And another direction, you can put a little in and get tons back. And that distinction seems to be the difference between what people do with what they hear and how they treat it. And I would suggest that obsessive thinking is doing a lot of thinking about it to resist it and defy it, when in fact the concession of it eliminates that obsessive thinking, just like a light turning on eliminates darkness. Boom, it's done. That's something.
Yeah, that's powerful. Your concession is just powerful. I'm really all about today concession, and to recognize doubt and to let it go, to find it and release
the seeing
it.
of it accurately, Jana, is the letting go of it, because there's no holding on when we're seeing things accurately. There is nothing to hold on to because we're not resisting them.
Yeah.
The seeming holding on is to the resistance to them that creates the sense there's something to hold, when all we're doing is creating pressure on our own thinking. And what's pressure? Stress. What's stress? Anxiety. What's anxiety? Disorders. Mental disorders, mental health, ill mental health, mental illness. What does it do? Cause our bodies to erupt and undermine our ability to stay healthy, and be accountable by accounting for what we're doing creates instability in our homeostasis, which is designed to maintain stability in our body. which gives our body the chance to fight off things that would normally come along that aren't good for it naturally. And when we undermine that, we become naturally susceptible to things that wouldn't otherwise affect us. That fear that we have is a conscious awareness that we know something's coming that we don't want. And to continue to produce the environment that creates that is pretty sick, to make believe that more of the same sickness is somehow going to cure the problem. Obsessive thinking is a distraction from what we're doing. It's an attempt to go numb to what we're doing. It's an attempt to desensitize our sentient capacity as beings in a human body and express it. And so it becomes dysfunctional.
So can I ask you what you might do in a particular circumstance?
Of course.
Okay, so I have this neighbor. He's 10 years older than me. He's 74, and he's a Vietnam vet. And that's pretty much who he is. And he makes it known that he is. But I have never given that a lot of weight. You know, I said, like, in the beginning of meeting him, like, thank you for your service. But he really sabotages himself with all the neighbors. And, you know, we're really rural and stuff. And I just feed him. I text him, and then I run up and feed him like a big bowl of, you know, coconut soup or something. And I just kept giving him just neutral and love and hanging. And yesterday I went up and I bought him an ice cream at the food truck, and we were hanging out. And he started into these stories, and they were 50 years old. And he was really getting comfortable and kicking back. And he goes, and then the guy did this, and then I did that. No, I don't. Like, he could change a fucking story after telling it for 50 years. He didn't know the specifics. And I go, I got to go. And he's like, well, you need to listen to this. This ruined my life. And I said, yeah, but it's not going to ruin mine. And I'm just going to leave you with your ice cream. And I got in my car and drove away. And now he's not speaking to me. And I didn't do it mean at all. I just said, I don't live that way. I can't go through. I go, it's not even torturous to me. It's almost comical that you would even think that someone would give you an audience to this. I go, I'm not being mean. I'm saving my own psyche from pretending to listen, because I just don't live that way anymore. So maybe I didn't handle it correctly, but he's not speaking to me. I'll bring him more soup. He'll take the soup.
So you have inroads. You know, my sense is, Jana, that we're not very good at having this conversation. So we tend to blow people off, literally, and tend to incite them in ways that make it more difficult to have the conversation, because for the most part, you're describing exactly how people shut down to one another by simply not abiding by the dictates of the story. You have offended him because the story is all defensive. It's all about what happened, not what's happening.
And I had to listen because it ruined his life. And I said, that's all the more reason not to. I said, if it's not happening to you right now, here today, I'm not interested.
So yet you have a reaction to it that seems to be pretty visceral too.
Yeah, it was like 103 degrees out there, and it was all dusty, and chickens were flying around. And I was like, I'm out.
So there are probably better and worse ways we can do things, right? And
yeah.
maybe what you're noticing is that you have either some regret or some awareness that there may be better ways to handle things. And our conversation, if you remember in the beginning, was pretty caustic for a long time. I mean, I had several people tell me to get fucked multiple times.
Yes.
Multiple times in a row.
Yeah.
Right? Or someone else to get fucked. Really hostile. Now, I don't know, because we don't have a large audience, that doesn't typically happen when you bring a lot of people together and give them the forum to begin to express whatever they want in any way they want. You're bound to find that, because I would say we've been reactive as a species for a long time to have done the things we've done in the name of being right, when in fact they've caused great harm and destruction to other people. So my sense is talking about this accurately elicits those responses, but as you're seeing them clearly, you're also seeing your own sensitivity to that stuff and the risk it poses to you, because you're starting to see accurately that you've been doing that so long that you don't want to continue. And there's a repulsion to it. And I would say that the obsessive thinking is a natural repulsion we have to lying that creates a reaction to a reaction to a reaction. And that's exactly what a chain reaction is in a nuclear power plant that eventually melts the power plant down. And what do we say when we have nervous breakdowns? We have meltdowns. So it's literally the physicality of the same thing that happens within the atomic structure of the universe happening within our thinking. And it's a good indication that what we're doing is overusing and overexposing, because ultimately a nuclear power plant will run fine if it's controlled. But if it loses control, there's almost no way to regain that control. And if you do anything wrong in that process, it's going down. The whole concrete mass that's supposed to be holding that energy in, the concrete's going to melt like water. That's how hot it gets. Our meltdowns and nervous breakdowns are not coincidences. They're the inability of continuing to maintain something that's gotten so out of control that we can't stand the heat. We have that term. You can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. We have lots of terms that align with this, that I said earlier, it's written in our face, we wear it on our sleeve, we bear it on our shoulders. We think about these weights as things that are tangible forms and images that we create to justify the things that we're doing. So to talk about it, in my experience, is one of the best ways, because I think talking is one of the most common things people do as proactive forms of communications. Writing, I would say, is less common. So developing writing skills takes a long time, because there's the combination of words that are possible to convey something is just like talking. But most people have a greater command over talking because it's something they've been done since they started crying to get milk or get their diapers changed. In some way, we were starting to communicate very, very young, and language tends to be conveyed largely in conversation. So that's why I suspect this conversation has greater legs, because it allows everybody to do what we do best in terms of conveying it. But even earlier, Ty was talking about the inexplicable ability to actually put words to it.
I did send him one of your
specific.
Yeah. I sent him probably the last text you sent me, that we can always make the choice to do, to think the wrong thought, or to be, that philosophy one. I sent that to him and let him sit on it for a couple hours before I went up there and bought him an ice cream. And he did say, he goes, I don't understand this at all. And I said, well, I wouldn't expect that just immediately you were going for it. But
so part of the communication, and this is really my sense is, and this gets back to Sturgis's thing, is what is the exercise here? My sense is the exercise is not here every week, because if you're relying on doing this every week, it's just a ritual. But if you start to see that the potential to be honest with people as you go during the week isn't to avoid them, but actually confront them. And to confront them doesn't mean to conflict with them. It means simply to address what's happening accurately. And if you're accurate enough about it in your communication, you're not going to necessarily instill reactiveness, but you certainly may, because it's hard to gauge how people are going to react. What I found is that when I started just saying what came to my mind rather than what I thought was right, I started saying things that were more meaningful. And in some cases, I elicited reactions that if I'd ever thought of, I wouldn't have said the thing.
but it was a more meaningful thing. It had to be said.
Yes. Yeah. So don't be afraid to say the wrong thing, because typically the wrong thing is all we've ever been saying. And we obviously are comfortable enough to continue to do it. So don't worry about that. When you're starting to consider that you can say the right thing, that rather than constantly fighting to say the wrong thing, saying the right thing will become a little easier to access. Like I said earlier, it becomes less interesting to repeat the same chronic thought when you begin to realize that you're re-choosing it everywhere you are in every moment. And you're actually beginning to define the future based on the choices you're making in the present, and yet in the present blaming the past for making those choices as though there's no other choice. That's crazy. We're actually predicting our future is going to be doomed because we're doomed in the thinking we're doing about the thinking we did about the thing we're thinking about that isn't happening in the past.
Well, and we tell each other about it. We meet each other and we say, guess what? I'm a nervous wreck. I've been nervous my whole life.
Yeah.
And then people go, oh, fuck, don't do anything kooky around her. She's nervous. I don't get it. I think it's, fuck. I maybe it's just in my foresight right now that everyone's been saying that to me, and I'm not feeling a lot of compassion for it. I think it's bullshit. Put them in my fucking shoes and see how nervous you might be, motherfucker.
But it also, I would say, is indicative of how you treat yourself over those things you think you've done wrong. and you're probably not very kind because you're probably not very honest. So you're abusive in your own internal dialogue.
No, that's not true. Oddly enough, I feel like I haven't done a lot wrong. I feel like I've done things right. I really do. I don't
Okay.
feel like it's a big parade. It's kind of a neutral thing. Like if I think like, oh, if I could have just done that one thing differently, it would have been better. I don't think that. That's what I used to think.
So
And that's what I used to
thinking you think it doesn't mean you're not thinking it. And let me ask you a couple of questions.
Sure.
Do you find yourself reactive?
Maybe not enough.
Do you find yourself impulsive, doing things
No.
so you don't have any impulsive behaviors?
Well, not a lot right now. I'm being pretty aware and pretty reflective and I know what's going on. I'm not buying and selling.
You feel depressed?
No, not as a state of being, but every so often, like maybe every 24 to 48 hours, like a day and a half, I'll get an overwhelming sense of horrifying grief from head to toe and bawl for like 10 minutes and then shake it off.
Okay. So let's say that grief is an indication of your awareness of grieving over things that you've done and are doing, because it wouldn't be there if it weren't continuing, that you think you can shake off because you're going to feel better about them. That's a maintenance of those things, not a dismissing of them. You can't dismiss them without reckoning with them. And if you're reckoning with them in ways you think they can be dismissed, it's like thinking that in your being state, there's no depression, because there is no depression in a being state. There is nothing to be felt in a being state because there's nothing thought in a being state. It's actually a state of bliss that doesn't even account for emotions because it's beyond emotions. It's just a white, absolute state of pure knowing being. Doesn't mean you can't have thoughts as some element of that, but that would suggest the thinking is somewhat distinct from it, or at least having its own opinion about that thing that it's absolutely certain of. So to the degree that those things come up, Jana, and I think, Gabe and I went through that. Gabe had quite an experience initially, but I'd said several times that as your awareness grows, you may start recognizing things you didn't think you were thinking. And we're so good at denial that we have things buried and think we're cautious, watching every step, not realizing it's because there's landmines in the steps we take, and we're afraid they might go off. And sometimes it's what that grief and awareness is.
Is it ever a good thing though that we have buried? What if it was something marvelous?
You would need to bury it. You would never bury it because you'd be utilizing it, and it would be shown in everything that you do because it would be principled and useful in everything that you do and applicable. Wouldn't need to be buried. The only things we bury are the thoughts we have and make believe that if we don't see them, they're not happening. So we say, no, I'm fine. Everything's fine. And it's a newness in the thinking we're doing because we've brought some more balance to it, but it isn't the end of that thinking. It's just catering to a new way of seeing it and doing it, just like we talked about the teeter-totter for 3 months. It's trying to bring balance. If you got to bring balance back to the teeter-totter, that means it's largely out of balance. So constantly you have a job to bring that balance to it rather than recognize that it's on stable ground. The teeter-totter, the basis of the teeter-totter isn't teetering or tottering. It's the plank that has the centerpiece that's going back and forth. The teeter-totter itself has to be on solid ground. We're on that solid ground that isn't even ground, but it's fundamental to our existence that it's absolutely stable because it doesn't change.
So the whole thing is that we think about incessantly on loop things in the past, our version, our perspective of things that happened in the past, because something in the future may not land, take form as we might think it should because of something we did then. So say like I lost $1 million in my divorce because I wanted to hurry it along and make it happen. So if I were to fret about that right now, because it wouldn't affect me right this second, we're not missing a meal. But in the future, it would be good to share that wealth with my grandchildren instead of him, the things that we fret about. So what if we just don't fret about any of that? Because that is not awareness or present time awareness. It's just conjuring up.
It's absolutely present awareness of how we're thinking about those things we've chosen to do.
And what if we don't anymore? I mean, there's no
in a
parade.
coma. You'd be in a coma. You wouldn't have any idea to do anything. You wouldn't make any choices, and you
No,
wouldn't
I mean
have,
those particular things. What if your thinking actually changes? What if you evolve? What if those things don't bother you anymore? Is that scary too?
well, having things the way they're not happening is scary to us because we realize how demented we can get about thinking about things that aren't happening. If what's happening is you feel at risk about those things, there's nothing wrong with having things at risk. I would say every choice we ever make is at risk because there's a good chance why we made that choice might not happen. So that risk is natural. It isn't something to pretend shouldn't be happening. And we're trying to perfect thinking so it stays still when thinking is always thinking, to try to live up to an absolute state of awareness of knowing that always stays still because it isn't thinking. The thinking that's thinking is always going to create some form of doubt. I would say every choice has an expectation, or we wouldn't bother to make the choice. We do not get up from the couch to go to the refrigerator because we just chose to walk to the refrigerator and hope that it would open and have something in it that we might like. We generally have an idea of exactly what we want to get from that refrigerator to go there.
Watermelon.
Choices, yeah. Coconut soup.
Yeah.
So choices come with that. They're all games per se. There's a chance in every game of losing, but the chance in every game for losing confirms the winning. And when you see those things as collective, they don't become as perilous as only seeing them as wrong, but starting to see that wrong is actually pointing to right. It's actually helping us adjust, like the sailor at sea, like Sturgis was talking about the sailboat, hitting that point at which it's just in the water at the right angle with the right trim on the sail. Everything is working accordance to how the wind is blowing. But if the wind changes, all of that changes immediately. So it requires us to change in relation to those things that are changing around us to be functionally literate enough to express the absolute knowing nature we have, rather than sit completely still and do nothing. It's easy to pretend you're at peace when you're sitting in a cave on a mountain because nothing disruptive is happening. And at the same time, most people that tried to do that would be very disturbed because there was nothing to distract them from what was going on. So we can meditate near a babbling brook and feel comfortable and peaceful, and get in our car and find that there's not much peace left over from that experience, because it's what we're doing in the present with what we have. And if we're fighting what we're doing, Jana, we're in conflict with what's happening in any way. So when we're at risk and we're feeling risky things, say, oh, I must have made a commitment to something that's risky. And I would say any commitment we made to make any choice is all at risk, because we may not get what we thought we wanted when we originally made the decision. But the flexibility is starting to see that what happens may be even greater than what we thought should happen, when all we thought that should happen was one thing, rather than recognize that all possibility is always possible, and everything that can happen may be much greater than everything we think should happen. And isn't it interesting that when we think about the outcomes and the fret and the risk, we think of it as loss rather than gain, because we're focused only on the idea that we think is right in the choice we originally made, rather than seeing that what is wrong to that choice might be the ultimate good for everyone. We lose sight of that in that restrictive thinking. So
When the concession's the gift, though, or I guess it's the present awareness that the concession gives, because that's the gift. When you just, that aha moment, and it's so subtle and it's so beautiful and it's kind of alarming and kind of not. It's just this most amazing. It's like that sail thing. It's the same thing, except not sailing.
Well, it doesn't end thinking, though. It simply gives you greater clarity on what's wrong with any thinking you may be doing, as a guide, like a sailor gets when the wind changes, to adjust the sail. To think that the sail should just be in that same state all the time would be to be very disappointed as a sailor. And to also think the thought that we have that it should stay that way is at risk when it changes. It's not at risk. It's just facing the consequences that can't always be predicted. The wind is very hard to see until it hits the sail. But when it hits the sail, you have a pretty clear indication of what's going on, because all the trim lines and things that indicate those little floppy strings that are on the sail are telling you how the wind is hitting the sail. They're all designed to give you information. We're not good as humans at taking the information we get and turning it into valuable, gainful purpose, because we're thinking all that should be happening is what we're thinking too much. We've misutilized thinking to think that thinking is reality. So we defend the thoughts we think are right only because we one point concluded it, rather than see it's what's happening now in relation to that thinking that's important and happening. Because it's the reason it's important is because it's happening right now. It isn't happening in the past. It isn't happening in what we thought. It's happening in what we're thinking. And that begins to allow us to function in ways that will surprise us, because what we thought was impossible will become a daily possibility. And that's a huge shift in awareness.
Well, that's the huge shift. And then the huge shift is so subtle, but it's still so positive. It's not like I feel a lack of the parade. I don't feel that lack.
Right.
But I do feel the subtle shift, and the shift, and that shift is in fact super subtle, but it goes on longer. It's just a constant state of being.
Yes. And that awareness, that now is your thinking starting to concede what it's always known, but you haven't utilized in a way that it would agree with you. So it was very disagreeable when it fought what was happening as being what wasn't happening.
And what goes through my head is everything's okay.
Yeah. Well, the nature of that being nature is you begin to realize that you can be in the midst of as much calamity as you can create, and it doesn't change. The book even says that serenity in the face of calamity is what neutrality is about. If I remember it right, it's connected to the point of neutrality, that we're taken to a place of neutrality. We're not taken to a place where we say we can never have a drink again. We're taken to a place where we can think about having a drink and see with clarity and proper proportion and perspective exactly where that's going to take us. So making sense of that as being the only thing to do makes less sense. So we stop doing that thing naturally. The same with the thing you're describing now, Jana, is that if you're starting to have that perspective, you're seeing things in proper proportion. The book says what we suffer from is a lack of proportion, meaning that nothing becomes everything and everything becomes nothing.
Right.
All of a sudden, as you have that clarity as a basis of understanding that your absolute being nature is not affected whatsoever by what you think, you start seeing thinking as something you're doing rather than something that's happening to you. And all of a sudden start to realize that it is your choice to have
responsibility.
It do what it's doing. Yes. Yes. So the reactivity, and I would say when you're feeling those griefful moments, unless you're in the face of grief, if it's coming up from seemingly nowhere, the present experiences, you're beginning aware to actually witness the things you've been denying in the present, and to chase them away is to continue to maintain them rather than actually let them dissolve in the light of your own awareness, beginning to be aware that you've been doing that. It's okay to do it. Perfectly okay to be grieving and mourning. It's natural for us to do when we're missing something. But when the thing we're missing is the point we're trying to be making, and it's all caused by our own thinking, there can't be any greater stress or trauma than the present traumatic stress disorder that we're doing, and the thinking that the thinking is reality rather than the awareness that we have an absolute state of being.
Like chasing your own tail?
Yeah. I mean, every dog that catches it lets it go.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's why they crop Dobermans.
I don't know, but this Nakai is here. This is my 10-year-old grandson, and he's been listening in for 20 minutes now, and he doesn't find it boring.
Well, because he knows, and he's concerned that adults don't seem to know what he knows.
Oh, he's an old soul and a very precious boy.
I have to go, guys.
Love you.
Thanks, Jen.
Aloha, Gabe.
I'll see you. We'll continue to talk during the week, Jana. Gabe,
Okay.
Thank you for coming, and Ty and everyone else.
Take care. Aloha. Thank you, Jack.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Jen.
you're welcome. You're welcome.
See ya.
Bye.